In 1979, the FBI launched a vast electronic surveillance operation at one criminal in particular, Allen Dorfman.
Allen Dorfman was the man that got things done, the power broker.
Allen Dorfman wasn't a mafioso. He wasn't even Italian. He was Jewish. And his weapon was not a gun, but a pen.
Dorfman was a white-collar type thug.
He had no real scruples or morals.
Dorfman's crime was to raid $1 billion pension fund for his mafia bosses.
The pension fund was a gold mine.
As the mafia's banker, he financed their huge casinos in Las Vegas.
He was a very powerful associate because he made money for it.
Dorfman was close to the mafia's heart and in the crosshairs of the FBI. This is the extraordinary story of how the FBI hunted Allen Dorfman, bugged his business, and caused one of the biggest disasters in mafia history. Allen Dorfman need not have been a mobster. After the Second World War, he returned to America a decorated Marine. But he could only find work as a women's self-defense instructor and sports coach, earning just $4,000 a year. Dorfman was going nowhere, and he wanted more. Luckily, he was close to one influential person who could fix him up: his stepfather. Paul "Red" Dorfman was a tough, old-school Chicago mobster. His power base was in the growing trade union movement, including the mighty Teamsters Union. By 1953, with 1.2 million members working in transport nationwide, a Teamsters strike could paralyze the United States. The Teamsters had what the mob liked: real muscle. An ambitious Teamsters official, Jimmy Hoffa, wanted to become president at the top of the powerful union. Red Dorfman agreed to help.
There was a lot of intelligence information that Hoffa had made accommodations with organized crime in order to rise to the power that he developed.
In return for supporting Hoffa, Red Dorfman wanted something back: a job for his son, running the Teamsters' lucrative insurance business. No matter that Allen Dorfman had no financial qualifications or insurance experience, he didn't even have an office. Such was the power of the mob that Dorfman's hastily set up insurance agency got the contract. The Teamsters employers now paid Dorfman's agency an insurance premium for every union man. And so, for new insurance executive Allen Dorfman, the good times began to roll.
He had very expensive clothes. I remember he wore what was clearly a very expensive camel hair coat. He drove expensive cars. He had a very nice house in Lincolnwood. He went out to eat at fancy restaurants. He had plenty of cash to spend.
The deal worked out well for both sides. Over the next 10 years, Allen Dorfman became a millionaire. And mob-backed Jimmy Hoffa rose fast in the Teamsters Union. But there was a cloud on the horizon. In Washington, the authorities were increasingly concerned by the unholy alliance of organized crime and the labor movement. In 1957, the United States Senate McClellan Committee began investigating union officials and mob associates. That meant trouble for Jimmy Hoffa and Allen Dorfman. Government agents discovered that Allen Dorfman had made $3 million from Teamsters insurance policies. Half of it by wildly overcharging on the premiums. The high insurance fees were not illegal, and the committee could do nothing about it. But committee investigators did soon discover illegal practices. Dorfman had siphoned off over $330,000 in cash from his company for unspecified expenses, and Hoffa had been lent cash that was never returned. A young lawyer, Robert F. Kennedy, was the committee's legal counsel. He asked Hoffa to explain himself.
Did you borrow all this money on the same day, and you don't know what it was for?
What's for expenditures that I needed at that time? I can't recall offhand.
And this was in cash also?
That's right.
And no collateral, no note?
That's right.
And no interest paid?
That's right.
Has it been paid back?
No, it has not.
Although the committee strongly suspected that stolen cash was being used for illegal payoffs and kickbacks to union officials, they couldn't prove it. That left Hoffa and Dorfman at liberty to exploit the wealthy Teamsters Union on an unprecedented scale. Although the Teamsters insurance business was a good money spinner for Dorfman, it was dwarfed by the possibilities of the vast Teamsters pension fund. Millions of dollars in workers' contributions poured in every month. The question was, where to invest it? Other funds invested prudently, spreading risk, but Allen Dorfman helped Hoffa pour tens of millions of dollars of Teamsters loans into just one client's pocket, the mob.
Teamsters especially, the pension fund, was a gold mine. It was the goose that laid the golden egg.
The Central States Pension Fund earned the nickname the Mafia Bank. And what did the gangsters do with all these millions? They built casino hotels in the Nevada desert. Las Vegas.
The first casino out here, the Flamingo Hotel, was built by the mob. As a strip group, not all of it was mob money. Most of it was.
The Stardust, the Fremont, and the Desert Inn were all funded by multi-million-dollar loans from the Teamsters Pension Fund. And in the 1960s, these casinos were owned and controlled by the Mafia.
Dorfman was absolutely instrumental in that. He engineered, by and large, the mob's influence in the Las Vegas casinos and the purchase of those casinos with the hidden interests of the various mobsters.
Hoffa and Dorfman approved 60 loans totaling a mammoth $91 million on strangely favorable terms to the mob.
The people who got the loans did not have to pledge any collateral, did not have to have the normal background checks that a bank would have conducted before giving multi-million-dollar loans.
There was a reason for this lax lending policy. Every time they approved a loan, up to 10% was taken as a kickback by Hoffa and Dorfman.
Allen Dorfman arranged a lot of loans. He took a fee on every one of them.
The kickbacks could be huge.
If you want to put up a building, and it would cost with your profit, $900,000 to put it up, but you got to give me $100,000. You make your bid $1 million.
Everybody thought that was fine. There was enough money for everybody.
The Mafia generally didn't like to pay money back. But provided Hoffa and Dorfman got their kickback, they didn't seem to care if the Teamsters never saw their money again. Dorfman and Hoffa were riding high, but 1961 saw in a new government and the return of an old enemy. Robert Kennedy was appointed U.S. Attorney General. As the top law enforcement officer in America, Kennedy's stated goal was to break the grip of organized crime. He set about radically changing the Department of Justice and the FBI. Kennedy launched a new kind of investigative unit, a Department of Justice strike force aimed at union corruption. And Kennedy dramatically increased the number of lawyers in the organized crime and racketeering section from 17 to 63. One unit was very much at the forefront of the campaign.
It was called the Labor Rights Unit, and I was in it. And the press called it the Get Hoffa Unit.
To get Hoffa was harder than it sounds. In October 1962, the unit did prosecute Hoffa, alleging he'd received improper payments from a trucking company. But the verdict was far from certain. Then, they got lucky. During the trial, Hoffa played straight into the government's hands.
If he'd accepted the jury verdict, he would have been found not guilty, and it would have been potentially a major victory for him.
A powerful manipulator and used to getting his own way, Hoffa just couldn't leave the verdict to chance.
He had to fix the jury, and he got caught fixing the jury, and that's obstruction of justice, and then he was convicted.
A maximum one-year sentence suddenly grew a whole lot bigger. Hoffa's mob-style jewelry tampering had backfired badly.
Outside the district court building in the nation's capital, Teamster boss James Hoffa surrenders to U.S. Marshals to begin serving an 8-year prison term for jury tampering.
Hoffa was gone. But for at least one person, this was a great opportunity. Before he went to jail, Hoffa announced, "Allen speaks for me on all pension fund questions." In those few words, the one-time sports coach was made one of the United States' most powerful financiers. Allen Dorfman now controlled a vast $400 million mountain of money.
The title CEO of Crime Inc. would be a good description of Dorfman, or perhaps a better one would be Chief Financial Officer of the mob. I don't think anybody could have done what he did because he had the skills and the character and the lack of morality to do what was necessary for the mob.
But Dorfman discovered he was not allowed complete control. Access to the pension fund was just too important to the mob. The Chicago outfit decided to safeguard the Mafia bank. They gave Dorfman an advisor, Joey the Clown Lombardo.
The outfit did not trust Allen Dorfman and therefore placed Lombardo in the position that he had, which was an overseer.
Joey the Clown Lombardo was a serious mobster. He may have earned his name joking around, but he was a shrewd businessman and a killer.
I don't think Lombardo respected anyone. I think he had a grudging respect for Dorfman for what he could do. But Joe Lombardo liked Joe Lombardo, and that was about the extent of the people he liked.
It was Lombardo who oversaw the Las Vegas casinos. And now, although he had no official position, guided Allen Dorfman at the Teamsters Pension Fund.
He did show up on almost a daily basis to find out exactly what Dorfman was doing and to provide guidance, to direct Dorfman to make sure that he did as the outfit wanted him to do.
That's the one person you don't hear Dorfman arguing much with.
But the two men got along well. With Lombardo's backing, Dorfman approved million-dollar loans designed to leach cash directly into mob hands.
It was no secret that he was in the pocket of organized crime. He was a tool of the Chicago outfit. They controlled Dorfman.
No matter that a string of businesses invested in by the Teamsters Pension Fund went bust, and millions of dollars was effectively stolen in the process.
Dorfman was a white-collar type thug. He controlled money. Dorfman would never be involved in a burglary or an armed robbery or an extortion. That's not what he did. He was a different kind of criminal.
Defaulted loans to just one businessman cost the pension fund $15 million. But Dorfman couldn't care less. He got paid thousands of dollars in a kickback on every one. Business was so good that he now crisscrossed the states in a private jet he'd bought from Frank Sinatra. But when one such deal and kickback went sour, the FBI pounced. In October 1972, the court in Chicago heard how businessman Leo Horvath had applied for a Teamsters loan of $1.5 million. He had personally paid Dorfman a $55,000 kickback in cash. 2 days later, Dorfman approved the loan. At last, this scam was exposed, and Dorfman was found guilty. It seemed the Mafia's banker was in real trouble. But for some reason, the trial judge sentenced Dorfman to just 1 year in federal prison. Far from being a killer blow to his career, it hardly even broke his stride.
In the 1972 fraud conviction, didn't rat on anyone, which probably enhanced his reputation with the mob at that time. And he did his thing and came out and kept on going.
With Lombardo behind him, Dorfman's looting of the Teamsters Pension Fund didn't merely continue uninterrupted, but shifted into high gear as never before. Between 1972 and 1976, he approved $186 million in loans to finance fevered mob development of Las Vegas casinos. $20 million went to Caesar's Palace alone, and $23 million to Circus Circus. And the kickback to Dorfman, 7% of Circus Circus Corporation shares, potentially worth millions. But the FBI hadn't given up the hunt for Dorfman. In 1974, they'd found enough evidence to charge Dorfman and Lombardo with milking the Teamsters pension fund of $1.4 million. Dorfman was again just a step away from a long prison sentence. Key witness for the prosecution was businessman Daniel Seifert, who had been talking to the feds. If Seifert testified, Lombardo and Dorfman were both going down. The Mafia didn't hesitate to protect their biggest source of ready cash.
They had no hesitation eliminating witnesses if it would keep them out of court.
One Saturday, Seifert went to his office to meet his wife. Mrs. Seifert was pushed at gunpoint into a washroom. Seifert made a run for it. The first shotgun blast failed to stop him, but a second blast to the chest brought him down. Finally, to leave no doubt, Daniel Seifert was shot at point-blank range. As Seifert fell, so did the court case. Lombardo and Dorfman walked free again. It was clear to the Department of Justice and the FBI that Joe Lombardo and the Chicago outfit would stop at nothing to keep Dorfman and the Mafia bank in business. And they were right. Even old friends were not safe. On the 23rd of December, 1971, Jimmy Hoffa had been given an early Christmas present. A pardon from President Nixon. But although released from prison, Hoffa also wanted something else, his old job back.
I have never sold a work around. I have negotiated the best contracts in America. Nobody can deny it. They don't even try to deny it. I've got eyeglasses, teeth, pension funds, conditions, and the highest wages in the whole world for our people. Talk to our people. Let them be the judge whether or not I'm a labor leader or whether I'm a crook.
The Mafia bosses felt their money machine was working well and considered Dorfman to be an essential cog. The return of Hoffa was something they could do without. Hoffa now rounded angrily on the mob. He spoke openly in the papers and on radio and television about exposing mob corruption and getting the mob out of the Teamsters Union. He even threatened to stop the Mafia from using the pension fund.
Jimmy Hoffa sincerely thought of himself as a tough guy, as tough as anybody in the mob. He never thought that he would come to the end he came to at the hands of the mob.
On the 30th of July, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa went missing.
Hoffa was last seen alive at the fashionable Red Fox restaurant in a Detroit suburb. He waited there in vain to keep an appointment. Hoffa left his car in the restaurant car park when he vanished, and in spite of an intensive search around Detroit, there's been sight nor sound of him since.
The FBI put 200 agents on the Hoffa disappearance and spent millions to find him. To this day, his body has never been found. If the mob thought Hoffa's disappearance had blown the FBI off course, they were wrong. In 1978, the government began to form an attack plan to get rid of Allen Dorfman once and for all.
We were after Dorfman, make no mistake about it, because he was the gear that made everything run as far as controlling of the Central States Pension Fund.
Stopping Dorfman would not only cut off the Mafia's money supply, more than that, following the trail of dodgy loans would allow them to convict mobsters throughout the US.
If we penetrated Dorfman and his contacts, we could get to other aspects of his association, which would include the mob, which would include the Teamsters, and as it turned out, high-ranking government officials.
The FBI realized that snaring Dorfman was not going to be quick or easy. To have any chance of success, they would have to use surreptitious electronic surveillance far more extensively than ever before. The plan was to record all Dorfman's phone conversations with his associates in the hope that they would incriminate themselves.
That was a tremendous manpower drain, and it was really a fight to get the FBI at that time to agree to put that many people in the case.
FBI chiefs worried that penetrating Dorfman was looking just too expensive.
They were concerned as to how long it would continue, which was fairly perceptive on their part because we intended to continue it as long as we could.
Another obstacle was that just tapping Dorfman's phone calls was far from straightforward.
Each call that came in on a separate line could have been transferred to Allen Dorfman in his office. And therefore, we could not simply tap one line. We had to tap all lines going into that office.
The problem was that for wiretap evidence to be admissible at trial, they would need a court warrant for each individual line.
We were going to be forced to request the ability to tap into approximately 15 or 16 telephone lines.
But in the end, they decided they had to go for Dorfman. On the 29th of January 1979, a court gave permission for multiple wiretaps, and Operation Pendorf began. The FBI rented offices nearby so the telephone company could redirect the phone lines. Agents could monitor and record all of Dorfman's phone conversations. Immediately, his world opened up to them. On that very first day, they heard Dorfman brokering a $90 million deal for the mob concerning the Aladdin Casino Hotel, Las Vegas.
Dorfman's days, as best as we could tell, when he was in the office, when he was actually working and not playing golf, was mainly communicating with the gangsters, fulfilling their needs, a problem solver, influence peddling, everything you'd think a power broker in legitimate business would do today.
Just how far removed Dorfman was from legitimate business was shown only a few days later. On February the 2nd, agents were stunned when Dorfman's conversations involved loan sharking, a takeover of the Teamsters pension fund, the unlawful use of gold certificates, and even a plan to kill the Teamsters president. And that was just one day's work for Allen Dorfman. Over the next 6 months, the FBI monitored 112,000 phone calls, recorded over 3,500, and focused on nearly 1,000 conversations. But it wasn't enough. The FBI needed to hear all of Dorfman's business conversations, not just when he was on the phone. To do that, they would have to bug his office.
The information that we developed on the telephones led us to have sufficient probable cause to ask the courts for the ability to put a microphone in his office.
But installing a secret microphone infringes a citizen's right to privacy. Getting court approval for this would be even more difficult.
Everyone was a little bit more skittish about that because the expectation of privacy was of considerable concern. So it was often much more difficult to get a bug because you had to show more to satisfy the officials in Washington that this was something that should be done.
Doug Roller won the argument in Washington and persuaded a federal judge to grant the warrant. With this to back them up, all the FBI now had to do was break into Dorfman's office.
We entered Dorfman's office surreptitiously late at night because we had an informant who worked for Allen Dorfman's office. We simply had my informant rent a parking place under the building, and we drove into the underground parking and went up into the building and went into the office.
Agents made 7 night raids to plant 2 microphones. Now, rather than his businesslike telephone manner, they got the real Allen Dorfman.
But all you get from him, your promises are bullshit. All I know is we ain't got a fucking thing. Now where the fuck are we going?
He was very gruff, a lot of profanities, and very arrogant, and became angered when what he wanted was not being done.
Did you ever give me a fucking dime, Morris? You ever give Hoffa a fucking dime? If you did, I don't know about it. And if you did, I don't give a fuck, because I didn't get nothing.
He did not mince words, and most of his conversations were laced with profanity.
But when the FBI microphones overheard Dorfman's meetings with Joey the Clown Lombardo, the agents heard the usually arrogant loudmouth transform.
He would walk around Las Vegas shouting orders like a Marine sergeant. And then when he met the mob boss in Chicago, he was a meek, mild businessman.
What he got out of it? I would say he got somewhere between 3 and 5 million. Maybe I got 25% beyond. That's right. That's the player we want right away. Well, you can make the demands. Make the demands. Now he's in trouble.
Our opinion of Joe Lombardo actually improved as we listened to the conversations. We overheard conversations most mornings where they were reading the Wall Street Journal, they were discussing the articles, and really there was no difference in the understanding of the material on the part of Lombardo as compared to Dorfman.
But there was a significant difference between Joey Lombardo and Allen Dorfman, as Lombardo clearly revealed on tape in a meeting with Morris Schenker, a Dorfman associate.
Allen's meek and Allen is harmless, but the people behind him are not meek and harmless. You know what I mean? And I'll tell you one thing. He says you're 72. I'm just telling you. I'm just telling you. If they come back and tell me to give you a message, and if you wanted to fire him, I assure you that you will never reach 73.
What the FBI had long suspected was now admitted on tape. Joey Lombardo was a mob enforcer and would stop at nothing to back up their money man, Allen Dorfman. Over 2,000 reels of Dorfman at his office, on the phone and in meetings, were recorded and transcribed. Even though he was unaware of this, Dorfman seemed careful and guarded.
Allen Dorfman, like a lot of the gangsters, didn't think that they would be caught. They thought they were too smart.
But Allen Dorfman made a mistake. With the mics on and the reels rolling, Dorfman was chatting with associates when he referred to an incriminating meeting. Thanks to the wiretaps, a jaw-dropping and damning story unfurled. Teamsters President Roy L. Williams had a problem with a government bill to deregulate the trucking industry. Any breakup of the Teamsters monopoly meant a loss of money and power for the union. Another person with a problem was Howard W. Cannon, the powerful senator for Nevada. Land developers were eyeing a plot next to his exclusive Las Vegas country club home. The planned 9-story apartment blocks would spoil his view and damage property values. The vacant lot was owned by the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund. At a meeting on Wednesday, January the 10th, 1979, Cannon and Williams met with power broker Allen Dorfman. Senator Cannon asked Dorfman whether he might arrange to sell him the 6 acres abutting his fancy home. Williams asked Senator Cannon whether he might arrange to personally oversee the trucking deregulation bill. They agreed a deal, in effect, a bribe. And to bribe a U.S. senator is a crime. In Washington, Cannon delivered on his part of the bargain. As chairman, he steered the trucking bill into his Commerce Committee, where it was delayed and watered down. But Dorfman found to his dismay that he couldn't deliver on his side. Recent legislation had stopped him dealing in land as he pleased. The bugs heard Dorfman vent his frustration.
In the bug, Dorfman is going on about, how terrible this was. These guys are pieces of shit. And in the old days, we could have just had the Teamsters out there bought in and give it to them. But we can't do that now because everyone's watching us.
A hidden microphone in Dorfman's office on May the 21st, 1979, captured the moment when Senator Cannon called to ask how the land deal was coming along. Embarrassed, Dorfman could only apologize for the delay. After he hung up, Dorfman announced to an associate,
"That was Senator Cannon."
How's he doing?
Huh? We fucked him around like no man has ever been fucked around.
He took care of deregulation, didn't he?
Hmm?
Did he take care of deregulation?
Of course, but we ain't fulfilled our commitment to him yet. I'm surprised he still even talks to him.
Senator Cannon never did get the real estate he wanted. But the FBI did get what they wanted. An incriminating tape recording. A clear record that Dorfman was involved in bribing a U.S. senator. At the beginning of 1980, after a record-breaking 13 months, the Chicago strike force went public with Operation Pendorf. The top-secret surveillance had worked. Senator Cannon was quick to defend himself from press accusations of any wrongdoing.
I unequivocally deny the implications of news reports that there is any connection between my handling of trucking legislation in the Senate and the resolution of a land use dispute in Nevada involving a homeowners group of which I was one member.
If Cannon was allowed to get away with it, Dorfman was not. The man who had stolen the Teamsters' millions was still in the sights of Chicago strike force leader Doug Roller.
We felt by the time the wiretap was over that we had a great deal of evidence to put together a prosecution. I felt we had an ironclad case.
But though it seemed that at last the FBI had Allen Dorfman on the ropes, he appeared unconcerned.
Dorfman in court was most of the time an arrogant gentleman. Although he was physically in court, present, that he was aloof to what was going on.
Yet despite the cool veneer, Dorfman was feeling the pressure.
At one occasion during the course of the trial, Allen introduced his son to me and stating that this is the motherfucker that wants to put me in jail. I just told Allen, you're a real class act, and walked away.
Dorfman faced the possibility of a long sentence, but he may have had reason to believe help was at hand. Because Dorfman could rely on more than just his lawyers. To protect their banker, the Mafia were helping the jurors come to a sensible decision.
Several jurors received early morning telephone calls from someone with a deep, gravelly voice who made insinuations about not knowing the whole story of the case.
When the jurors reported the illegal phone calls to the judge, he immediately sequestered them. They were held in a hotel, under guard, cut off from any outside interference. For once, the underworld's attempts at jury tampering failed. Traditional mob methods just didn't work anymore. No shotgun blasts could silence a witness. As the Pendorf tapes were played in court, the battle lines with the Mafia were redrawn. The accused had now become witnesses against themselves. As Dorfman's tape played, profanity, anger, and frustration resounded in court.
You know, when this commitment was arranged, Roy, you sat in the same fucking room. You made the same fucking commitment I made. Now, the property's gone. Fuck it. Let it go. But I'll tell you something. I don't give a shit if you have a deregulation shoved up your fucking ass or whatever happens.
Best evidence you can use in court is the defendant's own words. You cannot undo your words. You might try to explain them away, but if there are enough words there, you're sunk.
On December the 15th, 1982, Allen Dorfman, charged with conspiring to bribe Senator Howard Cannon, received the jury's verdict. Guilty. Operation Pendorf had struck its target, and it was a devastating blow. It was a grim Christmas in Chicago for 60-year-old Allen Dorfman. Although he was released on bail, the new year might bring him a 55-year prison sentence. But sentencing was not for 8 weeks. Plenty of time to cut a deal.
Facing a prison term would not have been something that Dorfman would have looked forward to with his high lifestyle. All the accoutrements of the rich that he had would all be taken away in prison.
There was now concern at the highest levels of the mob that Dorfman might not be tough enough to accept his fate and would negotiate with the Justice Department to reduce his sentence.
There had to be fear that in order to keep his sentence down or to keep from even being put in prison, Allen Dorfman might want to cooperate with the federal government.
Aging, out of power, and facing prison. If ever there was a good time for Dorfman to roll over on his mob friends, this was it.
The number of secrets that Allen Dorfman could have told us, it just boggled the mind. I believe that he could have helped us to completely cripple Cleveland, Chicago, Kansas City, Las Vegas, and maybe Los Angeles. He knew everything.
He heard things he shouldn't be hearing. He's seen things he shouldn't have been seeing.
We felt he would be vulnerable to an offer to diminish his prison sentence in return for his cooperation. Never got that far because the mob was thinking the same thing.
Suddenly, the man who'd loyally bankrolled the mob for years seemed a dangerous liability. Mob bosses decided to put out a contract on Allen Dorfman. On the 20th of January, 1983, Allen Dorfman and an old friend and associate went out to eat at the Hyatt Hotel in Lincolnwood, northwest Chicago. The lunch date turned out to be a date with destiny. Allen Dorfman had just kept 30 years of mob secrets the hard way.
And it's a part and parcel of life in the United States that close association with La Cosa Nostra often leads to a sudden death.
Allen Dorfman's death was a watershed for both the U.S. Mafia and U.S. law enforcement.
I believe it was one of the largest and perhaps most successful investigations of organized crime undertaken during this period.
Without Dorfman, the Mafia's money supply was suddenly cut off. This crippled the mob, and they never recovered.
No one replaced Allen Dorfman. No one replaced Allen Dorfman at all. They did not have access to that bank, and it was part of the death knell of that easy money for the mob.
Operation Pendolph had also done something else. It had proved the power of mass electronic surveillance and revolutionized the use of bugs and wiretaps.
Surreptitious electronic surveillance changed the playing field forever in favor of the government.
From now on, over and over again, electronic surveillance of a large number of mob figures and their operations would lead criminals to condemn themselves, in their own words, on tape. There was nowhere to hide, no witnesses to silence. The FBI had at last found a way to break the Mafia. Joe Valachi, hitman for the mob. And the first man to break Omerta, the Mafia's code of silence. Valachi was the first to give the world the phrase La Cosa Nostra. Valachi was the first to reveal the names of the bosses and their soldiers. He explained the Mafia's structure, their rituals and secrets.
It was the first time anyone could pull back the curtain or paint the canvas of what it was like.
Valachi was the first to expose their bloody history of killings and executions. I knew where the bodies were.
You lived by the gun and by the knife, and you died by the gun and by the knife.
Valachi was the first to blow the lid on a secret empire worth $40 billion a year. And his revelations would change the nature of the battle between the FBI and the Mafia forever. In 1962, 58-year-old Joe Valachi was serving 15 years in Atlanta State Penitentiary for heroin trafficking. And inside with him was his Mafia boss of 30 years, Don Vito Genovese, head of one of the most powerful crime families in America.
Joe went back a long time with Vito. He was in one of Vito's crews, so they knew each other very well, and he always thought he was in Vito's good graces. But Vito was a homicidal maniac.
One day, Vito Genovese arranged for Valachi to be his cellmate. Genovese could do this because he controlled the prison wings with fear and intimidation. Valachi guessed something was up and had good reason to be nervous. Genovese believed that Valachi had put him in prison after squealing to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. One night, Genovese turned to his cellmate.
You know, we take a barrel of apples, and in this barrel of apples there might be a bad apple. Well, this apple has to be removed, and if it ain't removed, it would hurt the rest of the apples.
Then, Genovese walked over to Valachi and kissed him on the cheek. It was the Mafia's kiss of death. To let Valachi know he was the apple to be removed.
Joe Valachi knew what this meant. It meant he was now going to be killed. One way or the other, Vito was out to get him.
Consumed with fear, Valachi saw hitmen everywhere. On the morning of June the 22nd, 1962, he was out in the yard when he saw 3 prisoners coming towards him. Thinking they had been sent by Genovese to kill him, he picked up an iron pipe left by construction workers and braced himself for the attack. Then, another inmate approached him. Valachi swung into action. Valachi's victim was John Joseph Saup, a small-time crook with no Mafia connections. Valachi had killed the wrong man. he was now facing the death sentence for murder.
Here he is, he's trapped, there's no way out for him. So he sends word to the federal authority that he's willing to sing, come a canary.
To save his skin, Valachi got word to the US Justice Department that he was willing to talk about the Mafia. For Attorney General Robert Kennedy and his staff at the US Justice Department, this was the break they were looking for. Since becoming Attorney General in 1961, Kennedy had pursued a vigorous attack against organized crime. But he had been struggling to penetrate the country's criminal underworld. Now, for the first time in the history of the Mafia, an insider was willing to talk. So Kennedy offered a deal to Valachi. He was permitted to plead guilty to a charge of unpremeditated murder and receive a life sentence on the one condition that he would expose his organization. On July the 17th, 1962, Valachi was secretly taken out of Atlanta prison and flown to Westchester County Jail, just outside New York. He was given the cover of Joseph DeMarcona and taken to an isolated cell. FBI agent James P. Flynn was sent to interrogate Valachi and find out what he knew.
Flynn came in and he was tough. He told Valachi, listen, either you tell us what we want to know, or you're no value to us and there's no deal involved.
The FBI had been picking up the phrase Cosa Nostra on recent wiretaps, and they believed that it referred to the Mafia, the organization, or the outfit. But they weren't sure. To get Valachi to loosen his tongue, he played a trick on him.
Flynn bluffed Valachi. He said, what, we know all about Cosa Nostra.
Thinking the FBI had a deeper knowledge of the Mafia than they actually did, Valachi began to talk.
And he, for the first time, revealed what it really meant. It meant our thing, Cosa Nostra. And he told Flynn, we never call ourselves Mafia.
Flynn started to pump Valachi for names, dates, and information.
The FBI only knew the tip of the Mafia iceberg. They really had never really penetrated the organization.
Now, the floodgates opened.
What Valachi gave them for the first time, knowing he had to produce, otherwise he was going to stay in prison for the rest of his life, he had to produce an inside story, really pull the curtain back, paint the canvas of what it was like to be a Mafia soldier in the trenches. So for the first time, he started spilling the beans.
Valachi began to reveal the organizational structure of the Mafia. Based on his information, Flynn drew up charts to illustrate how the Cosa Nostra is divided into family units. Each with a boss, an underboss, and lieutenants and soldiers beneath them.
It seemed to the FBI and everybody else that he was a Rosetta Stone. He was telling them the secrets. The hieroglyphics were now exposed.
Valachi told Flynn that these mafia families extended across America, from Boston to San Francisco. And for the first time, the FBI got a picture of the mafia's enormous scope and activities. For the next 3 months, from the end of September 1962, Flynn interrogated Valachi for 4 days a week. An average session would last about 3 hours, and then Valachi would become irritated and difficult to handle. Flynn realized that Valachi's main fear was that he could never escape Vito Genovese. Scarcely a day went by without some reference to his former boss. At times, Valachi would lose courage altogether, thinking he was going to die.
What good is it that I'm telling you? Nobody'll listen. Nobody'll believe. You know what I mean? This Cosa Nostra, it's like a second government. It's too big. I'm a dead man already, and I know it.
Valachi was right to be worried. According to FBI sources, members of the Genovese crime family were looking for Valachi. From his cell, Vito Genovese had put a price tag of $100,000 on Valachi, and now the mob had traced him to the New York area. The FBI, fearful that the Mafia would get to their prize witness, moved Valachi again, this time to the high-security army base at Fort Monmouth in New Jersey. By the spring of 1963, Valachi wanted to go public and was keen to expose the powerful criminal organization that he blamed for ruining his life.
Bobby Kennedy became aware of his potential as a person who could publicize how big and how important the Mafia was.
But Kennedy had huge concerns about Valachi's credibility. For the past 30 years, he'd been a ruthless Mafia hitman. According to the Justice Department, he had at least 33 murders under his belt. And was also now singing for his life. How could anyone be sure that Valachi was telling the truth? So the FBI decided to use it to test his credibility. Flynn had gathered material for the New York City police during his interrogation of Valachi. The police department had struggled with 30 years of unsolved murder cases, dating back to the Mafia gang wars and the subsequent Cosa Nostra power struggle. Using Valachi's accounts as a guide, the intelligence unit searched the department's files in a precinct-by-precinct operation, checking the scattered and unconfirmed facts against his detailed information. They found that Valachi's version of the gang slayings and killings, including the dates, locations, and the circumstances, could all be verified. With the FBI now convinced that Valachi could be relied on, they got him ready to testify. In September 1963, Valachi was flown to Washington to face an investigating Senate committee on organized crime across America. Over 2 weeks in October, he would appear as the star witness, giving first-hand accounts of life as a Mafia hitman. The hearings were broadcast across the country and became a national event.
Go right here, please. Go. Go, right there. Go, wait, go.
The United States is a new country. We don't have mythology the way older countries had. We had cowboys and Indians, and we had racketeers. This was a way for people within the country to look at all those movies that they had seen before about the underworld and put it all together. I think the public was fascinated by it.
The nation's underworld gets the unwelcome spotlight of publicity as the Senate's Investigations Subcommittee begins new hearings on crime. Arkansas Senator McClelland is at the helm. Attorney General Robert Kennedy paints a grim picture of the rise of lawlessness under the Cosa Nostra, or Mafia. This he describes as the government of organized gambling, narcotics peddling, extortion, racketeering, and controlling of certain trade unions. He says the income runs into billions.
Well, gentlemen, as you know, we have brought to Queens County this morning the witness, Joe Valachi. We are determined to expose every facet of his testimony and to pursue this thing as far as we possibly can.
What was his demeanor during your conversation inside over coffee?
Apparently, he's a willing witness, and he's anxious to get these things off his chest, and we had no difficulty with him at all.
Did he seem worried at all?
I wouldn't say he was worried. I think the man is naturally, under all of the circumstances, nervous and a bit upset. But beyond that, he's a good witness.
Mr. O'Connor, don't you get the feeling that he's rather enjoying all this?
I would make no comment about that.
As the hearings got underway, Valachi was asked why he had murdered another inmate in Atlanta prison.
Why did you decide to kill him at that time, at that spot?
Because he's the guy I spotted at that time. In other words, I felt that was my last day, in plain English, Senator. I felt that was my last day.
You thought it was your last day?
That I would be alive.
Well, did you feel that you could get all of them before they could get you?
Just probably, I don't know what I would have done if I don't see him. See, I can't answer what I would have done.
In other words, you felt helpless and surrounded, and you decided to strike when you could.
When I saw him, yeah.
You thought that if you killed this man, who you thought was going to kill you anyway, that this...
I got some satisfaction, Senator. Put it that way.
Got some satisfaction.
Despite all the razzmatazz surrounding this public event, Valachi's testimony was a stark reminder that he was a cold-blooded killer. Then Valachi's interrogation really began.
When did you become a member of this organization? 1930. 1930. What is the name of it? It is Cosa Nostra in Italian. Cosa Nostra in Italian. Our thing and our family in English. Our thing and our family in English.
Valachi then revealed how he came to join the Mafia. Valachi took the committee back to his low-life roots in the slums of New York in the early 1900s. His parents were from Naples, and they had 17 children. Only 6 survived. By the time he was 18, he was the driver with a notorious gang called the Minutemen. They robbed hundreds of clothing and jewelry stores between 1919 and 1923, smashing shop windows and grabbing whatever they could before the cops came. But one day they were caught, and Valachi was sent to the infamous Sing Sing prison on the Hudson River. In Sing Sing, the 21-year-old Valachi made friends with a gangster named Alessandro Volero. It was then that Valachi first learned about a secret organization that he would soon know as La Cosa Nostra. And Valachi wanted to be a part of it.
Now, we talk about myself now. I am a chauffeur, which I've been known through the years, that I was a good driver. In fact, other mobs used to try and borrow me, which I never wanted to go.
Valachi explained to the Senate committee how he became a driver for one of New York's top mafia gangs, led by Sicilian-born Salvatore Maranzano. It was 1929, and Maranzano was locked in a bloody power struggle with his rival, Giuseppe Masseria. Valachi made it known to Maranzano that he wanted in. And as a test, he was sent as the driver on a contract to murder one of Masseria's top henchmen. After the hit, Valachi got the call. He was going to be a made man or a soldier in the Mafia. Valachi then revealed to the committee the rituals of his initiation ceremony into the mob. Valachi described how he was driven to a country house about 90 miles from New York. Valachi said he was asked to join 30 other members around a table. His boss, Don Salvatore Maranzano, was going to conduct the initiation.
He told him how you got inducted, Omerta, the whole code. That once you became a member, you could never leave. How you had to either become an earner or be a hitman, kill somebody before you could even be qualified to be an inductee.
Valachi then revealed to the Senate committee the secrets of the Mafia's blood and fire initiation ceremony into the mob.
Well, he had the knife and the gun on the table. He went on to explain that you live by the gun and by the knife, and you die by the gun and by the knife.
Did you have a full understanding of what that meant at the time?
Yes, I did.
It meant that you was what?
Well, expect to die by the gun and by the
In
knife.
other words, when you took that oath, you expected someday to die either by the gun or by the knife.
Right.
That's what you were dedicating yourself to.
Right.
Valachi went on to explain that he was told to make a cup with his hands. Paper was placed inside and set alight. He was then asked to move it from side to side and told that he would burn like the paper if he betrayed the secrets of the Cosa Nostra. Valachi was then introduced to his gomba, his godfather, Joe Bonanno, who would be his guide and mentor. Bonanno asked Valachi for his trigger finger. And pricked it with his tie pin. He then pricked his own and placed it against Valachi's. Maranzano then announced that they are all family now.
All right, then what happened? Then they all shake hands. Everybody gets up and shake hands. They say a few more words together, which I can't recall. They also said in Sicilian.
But did you know what they meant?
Well, I never asked what it meant. I never did ask what it meant, but it meant like sort of in the style of an organization, or in that style. But you don't bother. I didn't bother. I never did bother.
You never did what?
I never bothered to find out what it meant, but I had an idea what it meant.
Well, you had an idea. What was your idea?
All tied up. Oh, we're all tied up.
We're all together.
All together.
All together.
Right.
Sink together, hang together, live together.
Yes.
Valachi's revelations explained why this secret organization had managed to remain hidden for so long. Anyone who squealed would pay the ultimate price. Fear had preserved the silence for 30 years. Now, Valachi had broken that silence forever.
Senator, can I say something, Senator?
Yes.
As to what I'm telling you now, I need to go no further to say nothing else. This is what I'm telling you, what I'm exposing to you and the press and everybody. This is my doom. This is the promise I'm breaking. That even if I talk, I should never talk about this, and I'm doing so.
The mob, of course, was horrified. And, in the past, they had been able to reach people in prison and kill them. And they thought somehow if they offered enough money, somebody would be willing to try to bump them off.
With Genovese's contract of $100,000 hanging over Valachi's head, there were now real fears of a direct attack on the Senate hearings.
What can you tell us about this threat, Jim?
Well, over the weekend, we received information from the FBI that their information was to the effect that the bomb would be placed in the room this morning, and also that there might be one or several persons here with guns who would attempt to assassinate the witness.
Now, what precautions have you taken?
I don't think we ought to talk about it.
How about Mr. Valachi? Did you tell him about it?
No, we didn't.
Well, there was supposedly a report that somebody's going to try to shoot you or put a bomb in here or something.
Where'd they get that?
What do you think about the Yankees and the Dodgers the other day?
I don't know anything about it.
How do you feel about it?
I feel I'm in the same position from the beginning. I'm hot from the beginning. You understand what I mean? Don't make any difference.
Most of Valachi's testimony was devoted to tracing the hierarchy of the American Mafia. Valachi explained to the Senate committee how the smooth-working Mafia organization of today evolved from the warring street gangs and power struggles of the early 1900s. Valachi took the committee back to a meeting in 1931 when Sicilian boss Salvatore Maranzano took control of the New York Mafia. Valachi told how Maranzano laid out his grand plan to an audience of 400 mobsters. That the gangs of New York would now be organized into 5 families to control the boroughs of the Bronx, Brooklyn, Manhattan, Queens, and Staten Island. Valachi told how Maranzano had declared himself the absolute ruler. He would be the boss of all bosses, and if anyone disagreed, they would be killed. Valachi then explained how one man did disagree. And he revealed how Charles Lucky Luciano had Maranzano executed. Luciano then introduced a more democratic form of leadership. He eliminated the boss of all bosses and created the Commission, effectively a board of directors to resolve mafia disputes. And this led to an era of peace, cooperation, and prosperity. Valachi then named the present leaders of the 5 New York families. Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Giuseppe Magliocco, Joseph Bonanno, and Gaetano Lucchesi. These are the men, Valachi told the committee, who run a huge web of organized crime in the city, involving gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, narcotics, and the infiltration of the mafia into legitimate businesses.
And about how many soldiers would usually be under a boss?
Well, Vito Genovese has about 450.
450?
In and around that. Yeah.
450?
About 450. Could be even 500.
Valachi then revealed the names of over 130 members of the Genovese crime family and identified members of all the other New York families, claiming to know 289 mafiosi. All was laid out for the committee on 5 huge family charts.
I think what Valachi did was explain what the FBI had and didn't know they had. Frequently, people in the mob and in other areas of criminal activity know others by nicknames. They may know their faces, but they don't know their actual names. To the extent that we now had law enforcement had their actual names, we probably learned that for the first time. But other than that, I think Valachi's testimony pretty much stands on its own. I mean, and it has been proven accurate over time.
Those that you have been able to identify in the 5 families, you have marked with stars up on these charts.
Yes. The others that are not on the chart, you know them by aliases, and you didn't know their other names.
Right.
And therefore, you didn't undertake to name them.
Right.
Except that you could give their real name along with their alias.
Right.
Very well.
He was the one who exposed it all. The families, the names of the people, the levels of authority, starting with the capo di tutti capi down to the soldiers.
But there were some critics skeptical of Valachi's testimonies, believing that as a foot soldier, he wouldn't have been privileged to any information relating to Cosa Nostra's inner circle.
I think it is a mistake to think of a soldier as being a low-level figure. They're not. They are serious people within the mob. The only people above a soldier in a direct line of authority is the capo and the boss. So the soldier is a person high up in the mob by the very nature of being admitted to the mob. They are given mob secrets. They are told about what has occurred. They need to know who other people are within the mob because they're free to cross anybody who's outside the mob, but no one who's in the mob. And so they tend to know a great deal.
Valachi used his testimony to get back at Genovese.
I think you might at this time digress just a moment to tell how much power, how much authority the boss, like Genovese, has over the family, over the soldier members like you.
Senator, I happen to know Vito's power. He not only has the power in our family, he also controls the power in Gabina family and the Lakiza family.
In other words, his word becomes law. That makes it legal.
Right.
Can he and does he pass out death sentences?
Well, he passes them out, then they tell you, well, he was a rat, he was this. They tell you anything they want to tell you.
He passes them out.
Right.
You know that of your own knowledge.
That is for sure.
Valachi's testimony was a gold mine. He confirmed Cosa Nostra was the Mafia. He revealed the names of the bosses and their soldiers. He explained their structure, their rituals and secrets. He exposed their bloody history. Above all, Valachi's testimony gave the FBI the targets and led to a change in priorities. By 1963, the FBI's New York office had increased the number of its agents specializing in organized crime from 4 to 140. The following year, the FBI used hidden microphones to record Teamsters union boss Jimmy Hoffa in a series of exchanges with the Detroit Mafia. He was jailed for 8 years. For the FBI, electronic surveillance was the future for cracking down on organized crime.
I remember as a young agent, as a young organized crime agent in the early 1970s, all over the country we did wiretaps of the interstate gambling operations that flourished and were controlled by the Mafia. We made thousands of arrests and broke up hundreds of large gambling combines in an effort to choke off the flow, one of their great sources of money.
Thanks to Valachi's revelations, the FBI's campaign against the Mafia progressed to a new level. Critically, for Attorney General Robert Kennedy, it was just the beginning.
The disclosures of Joseph Valachi and of others with knowledge of criminal operations in various parts of the country have helped to give us unprecedented understanding of how these operations work.
Valachi was the first really important cog in bringing down and destroying, or at least wounding, the Mafia in America. Without him, it might have taken another 15, 20 years, because there were no defectives. Even though he was low-ranking, he still knew enough to sensationalize his story and to get the public really alerted and warned about the threat of the Mafia.
As for Joe Valachi, he was returned to the relative comfort of the District of Columbia Jail in Washington, where he had been kept during the hearings. Robert Kennedy, ever shrewd, believed Valachi had a lot more to offer.
Bobby Kennedy realized that there was a gold mine in him. So what he did was said, why don't you write your memoir, everything you can remember about the Mafia?
Over 13 months, Valachi painstakingly produced more than 300,000 words on notepads from his cell in Washington. He had been there from the very beginning of the modern Mafia, and it was a unique day-by-day portrayal over a 30-year period of his life as a hitman. But for someone who had very little schooling, Valachi's memoir was no literary masterpiece.
It's unprintable, it's unpublishable, it's unreadable probably.
Kennedy called for a ghostwriter.
The Justice Department got a writer, Peter Mass, to sit down, use the memoir, and also discuss Valachi's life with him.
This was to form a book which the Justice Department hoped would encourage other informers to come forward. During this period, the department started making plans to reward Valachi for his cooperation, and were even thinking of sending him somewhere to relax in the sun.
Bobby Kennedy had some wild scheme that maybe he could find a girlfriend or bring Valachi's wife and put him on some desert island where he could live out the rest of his life. But that was impossible. And he still had a sentence from murdering that fellow convict, the wrong man.
But killing the wrong man wasn't the only thing stopping him going to a desert island. The Italian-American newspaper, Il Progresso, had got hold of Valachi's manuscript and was outraged. It printed a virulent editorial against the forthcoming book, saying it was perpetuating the kind of image of criminality associated with the many Italian names in Valachi's testimony. This snowballed into a massive surge from pressure groups proclaiming it would slur all Italian Americans. Their campaign was successful. The White House stepped in and halted its publication. Overnight, everything changed for Valachi. He was told the whole thing was off and was hauled out of his Washington comfort zone and transported back into the harsh federal prison system. He was placed in a small, cold cell in Michigan, where he was to spend the rest of his sentence in solitary confinement. Valachi despaired. On the morning of April the 11th, 1966, he took the mains lead from his radio and stepped into a shower cubicle. Showerhead was unable to hold Valachi's weight, and he was found collapsed and barely alive on the floor by a guard soon afterwards. The Justice Department realized that they had to look after their prize witness better.
They took him out of the unpleasant northern prisons. They sent him to what they considered the best place for him, a place called La Tuna, near the Mexican border in Texas. they gave him a suite where he had a kitchenette and he had a better, more comfortable bed. They tried to make life as convenient and comfortable as possible. Whenever the Justice Department now gets a real top-notch defector, they send him to what is called the Valachi suite.
In 1968, and 5 years after he had given away the Mafia's secrets to the world, Valachi finally got to read the book based on his life. It was called The Valachi Papers, and it became a bestseller. Valachi never received a penny from it. The book was turned into a feature film in 1972. Valachi was played by Charles Bronson. The real Joe Valachi died of a heart attack in 1971 at La Tuna Federal Correctional Institution in Texas. He outlived his Mafia boss, Vito Genovese, by 2 years. The $100,000 bounty placed on Valachi's head by Genovese was never collected. This is a story of missed opportunities, of how New York's finest repeatedly failed to snare the Mafia's most bloodthirsty killer, Roy DeMeo.
What Henry Ford was to automobile industry, Roy was to killing. He streamlined it, he organized it, and he killed with efficiency.
In the 1970s, DeMeo embarked, unchecked, on a murder spree.
But when Roy killed you, your body was not found.
His victims may have numbered as many as 200 people.
Roy DeMeo was as guilty as any serial killer. Not only did he kill them, he cut their bodies up and defamed them and their humanity forever.
People would be killed because they happened to accompany a target.
If you looked up the word evil in the dictionary, his picture would be there.
The big question is, why didn't the police and the FBI stop Roy DeMeo sooner? In 1975, detectives working for the New York Organized Crime Squad made a gruesome discovery. It was a quiet Sunday in Queens. Here, in an alleyway behind the Pantry Pride meat market, the police discovered the remains of a young adult male, stuffed in various garbage bags. The victim was Andre Katz, a small-time criminal.
Andre Katz was a car thief, a very, very good car thief. And he was supplying cars to body and fender places, and he was supplying cars to used car lots.
Katz came from what was then a dangerous part of town, the Canarsie district of Brooklyn. During the 1970s, Canarsie was the city's car crime epicenter. It was infamous for its body shops, garages, and salvage yards. Back then, many of the garages were so-called chop shops, specializing in cannibalizing stolen cars for the parts. But as the discovery of Katz's body showed, somebody had been chopping up more than just cars. No one would realize then that this gruesome discovery was the first clue in one of the most shocking crime sprees ever, begun by one of the Mafia's most bloody murderers, Roy DeMeo. Roy DeMeo's life could have been very different. His mother had wanted him to be a doctor. An uncle was a big-shot prosecutor. Another was a forensic scientist. But Roy DeMeo never showed such promise. After a start as a delivery boy and part-time apprentice butcher, he finally settled on a life of crime instead. By the late 1960s, Roy DeMeo was doing well for himself in his chosen career. He was a successful street thug and racketeer. But DeMeo wanted more. He yearned to become a made man, a fully paid-up member of a mafia crime family. And soon, he got what he had always wanted. One day, he received a call. Somebody was looking for a meeting. The call came from this house. It was the home of Nino Gaggi. Gaggi was a mafia captain in the infamous Gambino crime family of New York.
He was brought into the operation by Nino Gaggi, and Nino Gaggi worked for Paul Castellano, who was the head of the Gambino family.
The Gambinos were the most powerful of the 5 crime families that ran the New York underworld. For DeMeo, it was an honor. A meeting with Nino Gaggi could be the first step on the path to becoming made. Gaggi placed DeMeo on the first rung of the mafia ladder. He was made an associate, working in partnership with Nino on various schemes to increase each other's wealth. DeMeo's business interests were a perfect match: loan sharking, gambling, theft. The honeymoon started well. DeMeo expanded his loan shark book. And soon, Roy DeMeo was doing what any mafia boss wants. He was making lots and lots of money. But DeMeo was more than just a loan shark. He was an entrepreneur. He also started to eye up other areas of criminality, like pornography. At this time, hardcore pornography was illegal. Some family bosses, including the Gambinos, frowned upon it. But DeMeo decided it was too good an opportunity to pass up. Nino Gaggi turned a blind eye for one simple reason: the money was excellent. To help him enforce his deals, DeMeo built around him his own specialist team of criminals. It became known as the DeMeo Crew. Each member had their own area of expertise. It included Chris Harvey, real name Rosenberg, a 24-year-old with a vicious temper, and a love of fast cars and drugs.
Chris idolized Roy. He wanted to be Roy. He wanted to be in the mob.
Freddie DeMeo. He was their getaway driver.
Freddie was a racing car driver and was highly respected as a car thief. He could get away with any kind of a police chase.
Other crew members included Joey Testa and Anthony Center, who were so close they were nicknamed the Twins. In all, it was a curious mix of characters, but they were united in their admiration of DeMeo.
They looked at him as a father image. As he moved up the line, he'd be able to move them up the line. Roy was a father figure, a mentor, and their boss.
The gang used to hang out at a bar here on Flatlands Avenue, Brooklyn. Today, it is a church, but at the time, it was called the Gemini Lounge and was the DeMeo gang's clubhouse and base for operations.
Gemini Lounge was a neighborhood watering hole. Wasn't a disco, it was a very quiet bar where a man coming home from work could go in for a drink. The only exception to it was the fact that it was owned by Roy DeMeo.
From his base at the Gemini Lounge, DeMeo started to expand his criminal operation.
Roy was an entrepreneur. He looked at many ways of expanding his business, and he did it tremendously well.
In 1972, he pulled off an extraordinary feat for a career criminal. He moved into the world of finance and got himself elected to the board of directors of a small bank, the Brooklyn Credit Union.
Originally, Roy got involved on the orders of Nino to help launder money.
But DeMeo didn't stop there. He saw an opportunity to steal cash as well as launder it.
So what had happened is Roy moved into it, organized it, but then took it a step further.
DeMeo began to embezzle money. He plundered the bank's capital and got other directors to do the same. By the time he had finished, it went bankrupt. By then, it had netted him and Nino Gadji hundreds of thousands of dollars. The collapse of a bank, even a small one, could have been a disaster for DeMeo. Because the FBI and tax authorities started to investigate the failure of the credit union. But both Gadji and DeMeo had already moved on, and nothing could be pinned on them. The result? They were free.
Then they just walked away from it.
DeMeo had managed to elude the authorities. Now, he thought he could get away with anything. Even murder. By 1973, Roy DeMeo was 32. His pornography business was doing well, but DeMeo felt it could do even better. Then, one of his business associates, Paul Rothenberg, was arrested. With Rothenberg under pressure, Roy DeMeo feared he might reveal his own part in the industry, so he planned to take action. In July 1973, he coolly picked Rothenberg up and drove him to a quiet part of town. It was his very first kill. The execution changed him. He found that killing gave him power. He would now not hesitate to murder again whenever an obstacle presented itself. The opportunity to do more killings soon arose, due to DeMeo's increasing interest in another profitable business, car theft. The DeMeo crew was becoming big in lucrative car crime.
They had a highly set up organization of 17 to 20 car thieves a night.
In New York, there was huge amounts of money to be made. A car was often worth more for spares than as a running vehicle.
And everybody had their order. Everybody knew their assignment.
Cars were stolen by his crew and either given new identities or broken down in the Canarsie chop shops.
They were not just to go out to steal any car. They knew exactly what kind of a car they had to steal.
Somebody would want a Jaguar. Somebody would want a Cadillac. Somebody would want a Porsche. They would steal on order the exact car they wanted, the model, the year, the whole routine. Any luxury car you need parts for eventually. So what they started to do then was to chop them up and sell the parts. I mean, it was a very lucrative business.
It was at the height of all this that local car criminal and associate of DeMeo, Andre Katz, got into trouble with the police.
Andre got pinched for narcotics. And they were afraid he would rat out to the police.
Fearing that Katz would squeal, he consulted his mentor, Nino Gadji.
So after having a meeting with Roy and his capo, Nino Gadji, the order came down was to kill Andre Katz.
DeMeo prepared an elaborate plan. Katz was lured by a female accomplice into a trap.
He was grabbed by them, and they put a noose around his head and dragged him into a car.
Then, DeMeo and his crew took Katz to the Pantry Pride meat market in Queens. But this time, DeMeo did something different. Inspired by the surroundings, he put his training as an apprentice butcher to good use. That's how Andre Katz ended up in pieces in several garbage packs.
The next thing you see is the headlines is a dismembered body found in the back of Pantry Pride. And what a bum thought was a leg of lamb was actually Andre's thigh with a tattoo on it. They wrapped it all up in butcher paper, and it was neatly placed in the fat disposal bin behind Pantry Pride.
In fact, DeMeo had made a mistake. The body parts were found because the rubbish wasn't collected over the weekend. But yet again, DeMeo got away with it. The 1975 police investigation into Katz's murder failed to discover the gang's involvement. No witnesses came forward. No incriminating evidence was found. For retired homicide detective Joe Wendling, the reason was because Katz was the wrong kind of victim.
If it's a store owner and he's killed, there's the outcry. But when an organized crime figure is killed, there is not that much outcry. There's not that much interest that the other detectives place. And I viewed this as a tremendous weakness. And I always went to my boss, and sometimes I had to get down on my hands and knees and beg him, is to let me look into the homicide.
Now, Roy DeMeo began to get a taste for this way of killing.
Roy DeMeo was probably one of the most vicious, uncaring lowlifes that I ever came across.
Dismemberment was rarely used by the Mafia, but for DeMeo, it now became his signature.
He had no respect for human life. He had no respect for anybody except himself. If you looked up the word evil in the dictionary, his picture would be there.
DeMeo found that anyone could be made to disappear.
They would cut the body up, dismember the body, neatly wrap the body, and the parts were placed in dumpsters.
The dumpsters were emptied, and the contents taken to the immense Fountain Avenue dump in Brooklyn.
All of the garbage from Brooklyn and Queens went to that dump.
And the Fountain Avenue dump had a special area designated for meat byproducts. And it had to be covered immediately with dirt. Then the bulldozers covered everything.
So if you dump something there, you're not going to find it ever, ever, ever. So that's why they used it.
More and more people started to vanish.
We had a number of people that disappeared, and we never found them. Here was a group of men that were murdering people, and the bodies were never found.
Today, the dump has long since been filled and landscaped. There is little clue as to the number of bodies DeMeo sent there. As well as using the dump, the crew also disposed of their victims another way.
They dumped a lot of the bodies in the Atlantic Ocean, too. They cut the bodies up, put them in hefty bags, and dumped them off a boat out in the middle of the ocean.
DeMeo became more and more skilled at his job. He was getting so proficient that even the family boss, Paul Castellano, came calling for his hitman services. He had found out that his son-in-law was cheating on his daughter.
One of the bodies was Paul Castellano's son-in-law, and she had a miscarriage because she caught him cheating on her. And Paul had DeMeo kill his son-in-law.
Again, the body was never found. Amazingly, despite all the disappearances, the police department failed to spot a pattern, except one person, Detective Joe Wendling. First Wendling, and then another colleague in auto crimes, John Murphy, spotted something. All these murders were linked to the world of car theft.
I developed an informant that said, look at the amount of car thieves that are disappearing. I think they're cutting them up, and that's why we're not finding them.
But despite his lead, no one took it further. Few shared Wendling's enthusiasm to investigate deeper. In fact, the forces of law and order were in crisis. Financial mismanagement meant recruitment of police was frozen. Morale was low, and the public's faith in the police department had sunk to pitiful levels. The auto crimes unit was overstretched, and the FBI were not interested in local car crime. So these were great times for DeMeo. With nothing to stop him, business boomed. 77,000 cars were stolen in New York City in 1974 alone.
No area in the country is safe from the car thief. It affects everybody in the country. The big metropolitan areas, however, are suffering the most rapid rate of growth.
For DeMeo, the money kept flooding in.
Oh, it was a tremendous epidemic of car crimes in New York. And there was a tremendous slew of warehouses found with skeletons of cars in them.
However, DeMeo wasn't having it all his own way. Another law enforcement unit was looking at his crew's meetings at the Gemini Lounge. It was a separate outfit, the Organized Crime Task Force of the Queens District Attorney's Office and Detective Kenny McCabe.
Kenny was the intelligence officer of the DA's office. He maintained all the organized crime files. He covers all the funerals. He covers all the weddings. And he writes his little notes, and he has folders upon folders of all the families.
Then, Joe Wendling, John Murphy, and Kenny McCabe did what the wider law enforcement community were failing to do. They started comparing notes. Convinced DeMeo was involved in murder, the men started surveillance, but they could only do so in their own time. What had escaped them, though, was that DeMeo had just received a massive promotion. In 1977, Roy DeMeo got what he had always wanted. He became a fully paid-up mobster and was formally inducted into the Mafia crime family.
There was two ways of being made in the mob. You become an earner or you become a hitter, right? You kill somebody, you earn. Roy DeMeo was both.
Roy DeMeo became a so-called made man, working full-time for capo Nino Gaggi. It was a huge moment in DeMeo's life and the realization of a dream. So DeMeo and his crew were over the moon. With this elation came more murders. It was going so well, the crew even took up freelance work for any paying customer. It was murder for hire, what became known as the murder machine.
Roy decided to expand the business into killing. Not just killing enemies, but now killing for the families. He'd take in any contract. He'd invite them to a party, and that would be the last time you see him. That's what Roy did. He expanded the murder.
1979 was a high point for the DeMeo murder machine. To cope with demand, the crew took the killings and dismemberments in-house. Now most hits were done in the rear of the Gemini Lounge, using a well-practiced method.
Now behind the Gemini Lounge, there was an apartment rented by a guy named Joseph Guglielmo. They would lure their victims to the place, and they would bring them in.
The victim would be shot in the head by Roy DeMeo, and the head swiftly wrapped in a towel. Chris Rosenberg would stab the victim in the heart to stop the bleeding. Then, the body would be left to drain for 45 minutes.
They brought him into the bathroom and put him in the tub. Then they cut the body up and put all the parts in a hefty garbage bag. After they got done cutting the body up and draining the blood out of it in the bathtub, they all sat down with Roy DeMeo when they ordered a pizza, and they were eating the pizza with bloody hands. That's how despicable these people were.
After a while, the dismemberment process became a sadistic ritual.
There was no need to do this. This was just, how would you say it, vicious evilness. I mean, mob heads normally aren't done that way. Why go to that length when they could just put a bullet in his head and dump him in the ocean? They did it just to be vicious. And that was DeMeo's doing because he was a psycho.
Despite killing nearly 100 people, Roy DeMeo could now do bigger and bigger deals. So he got involved in a major plan to export stolen cars to Kuwait. He was now an international criminal. Needless to say, several people were made to disappear in the process. But the plan netted him and Nino huge profits. In no time, orders for 5,000 cars a week were coming in via his contact in Kuwait. As a sideline, DeMeo was getting deeper into cocaine deals as well. Drugs were frowned upon by Paul Castellano, as they tended to attract attention from law enforcement. Nevertheless, mainly through crew member Chris Rosenberg, coke deals came thick and fast. In early 1979, Rosenberg went to Florida to buy some coke off a group of Cubans.
Chris Rosenberg goes down to Florida and goes to a narcotics deal for $1 kilo, and they're going to be delivering it to New York.
On his return to New York, Rosenberg made a major mistake, which would have massive consequences for DeMeo. The Cubans came to deliver the drugs.
They come up to New York to sell him the key. Him being the entrepreneur that he is, says, hey, I'm not going to pay them. I'm going to kill them. And he kills them. He winds up killing 3 people.
The Cubans' bosses were outraged by Rosenberg's actions.
When Roy found out this, he said, they're going to send an army up here, and he said, they're going to kill you. And they said, what name did you use? And he says, I went by Chris DeMeo. Roy says, my God, my family's dead. They're going to come up here and kill my whole family.
Rosenberg's killings risked an all-out Cuban war with the Gambino clan. In recompense, the Cubans demanded a scalp in what became known as the Cuban Crisis. So DeMeo decided to offer up a sacrifice. His friend, Chris Rosenberg.
So he decides Chris has to go. They stab Chris, he shoots Chris.
They had to make sure the Cubans knew they had kept their part of the deal. So DeMeo could not make the body just disappear. He needed a stunt.
Chris can't be dismembered. Chris has to be left, so it's going to make front-page headlines. They parked him on Floyd Bennett Field, sat him in his car, put a 9mm between his legs, and then machine gunned the car. And yes, it did. It made front-page headlines.
With Rosenberg gone, DeMeo returned to business. And he remained popular with his Gambino family boss, Paul Castellano, because of his specialist skills.
Roy wasn't going to get killed because Paulie needed his guns. DeMeo and his men were very, very well respected. And this added power to Paulie. Nobody would make a move on Paulie. So that's how important Roy DeMeo was to Paulie.
However, the Cuban crisis did leave a mark on DeMeo. He became paranoid the Cubans wanted to kill him. This caused him to make a major mistake. He mistook an 18-year-old vacuum salesman for a Cuban assassin.
Roy was so nervous about it that a poor Electrolux salesman, going around to the houses in Mississippi, comes up to his house to sell him a vacuum cleaner. They chased this poor individual halfway across Long Island and killed this guy, and then disappeared.
Despite the killing being in broad daylight, law enforcement drew a blank. No witnesses dared come forward. But this time, the Gambino family boss, Paul Castellano, started to get concerned DeMeo was drawing too much attention. Then, in late 1979, Castellano wanted to kill 2 made men in his family, so he instructed Nino Gaggi and Roy DeMeo to make the hit.
And the order was sent down to Nino Gaggi, kill him, and you do it. So Nino trusted his right-hand man, his top killer, Roy. So they set up a meeting with a father and son. They had them in the car, but the father realized this is not going to turn out well.
A local off-duty policeman saw the murders and gave chase.
A sergeant trying to raise money in his off hours driving a cab sees this flash and everything stops and winds up at a big shootout. Nino gets shot, Roy escapes.
The simple fact was that the murder and shootout involving a policeman was something no one could ignore. So at last, the investigators began to join all the dots between DeMeo and his crew, between car crime and the numerous Canarsie murders, and between Nino and headman Paul Castellano. Then, the FBI made a key breakthrough. In 1980, a customs official working the docks spotted a consignment of cars destined for Kuwait. It appeared the cars had been stolen and given new registration documents. The intelligence quickly led to a warehouse. The FBI raided it to find it full of stolen cars ready to be exported by DeMeo to Kuwait. A fingerprint at the scene pointed to the DeMeo crew.
It just showed you the scale of the case. Here was a mafia family not only selling stolen cars in Brooklyn, but shipping them out to another country. I mean, this was unheard of. This now became an international case. It became very interesting to everybody, and everybody wanted a piece of the cake.
By 1982, the pressure on DeMeo was stepped up. A new task force moved into offices at Foley Square, New York, to take over the running of the case. It was headed by top-shot prosecutor Walter Mack.
Walter is such a total attorney.
And this guy, Walter Mack, is one of the finest prosecutors I ever met, without any question. I mean, the guy had guts, and he's the one who put this whole case together.
The man just throws himself into a case with his full soul.
Mack's task was to bring all the crime agencies together under one roof.
The team was put together of federal, state, local, city investigators.
The team soon included Joe Wendling.
We sat down, we sparked Walter's interest, and we asked Walter to make a promise to us that if he took this case, he would see it through its end.
Walter Mack did. And soon, it became very clear that what had started as a large-scale car crime case was turning into something even bigger.
The police department at the time had brought an autocrime case over to us. Really wasn't considered a mafia case, although there was some expectation that the mafia would emerge. It was pretty much an autocrime case.
As Mack and the team investigated further, Roy DeMeo's murder machine emerged.
And what happened in the next 6 months to a year was an extraordinary combination of motivated investigators who felt strongly that the individuals in the crew had evaded responsibility for truly heinous acts, and they were looking for some means and mechanism of perhaps drawing it all together.
Slowly and surely, Mack and his team built the case against DeMeo and his boss, Nino Gaggi. This time, they were determined they would not elude them.
It was a commitment to the victims, the moms, the husbands, the wives, the brothers, the sisters, that it was time to bring justice to this situation, and that's what kept them going.
One tactic they explored was to pester DeMeo to see if he would crack. Soon, they had something to get him really worried. A major breakthrough. One day, the phone rang. A new informer, calling himself only Harry, professed to knowing all about the stolen car ring. Harry was Vito Arena, an associate of the DeMeo gang.
We take him into Manhattan on a Sunday night with nobody there except the U.S. attorney and us, and we sit him down and we tell him what we want. We want all the information about the chop shops and the homicides.
Arena began to sing, and their jaws dropped.
Vito Arena sits us down for the next week and a half and fills us in on every homicide they did and how they did them and how they cut the bodies up. Says the easiest part of the body to chop up is the head. The head snaps off like a pencil. And we're like in awe of this guy. We never heard anything like this in our lives. And he tells us all about Roy DeMeo.
To prove his credentials still further, the informant pointed the team to one of the victims, Joe Scorney. His body was found just where Arena said it would be, in a barrel of cement at the bottom of a lake.
We find the body, it was all skeletal now. And there's the dungaree jacket, dungaree pants, and a wallet in his jacket. And by virtue of that wallet, he had his dentist's name in the wallet, which gave us the ID in about an hour.
As a result, Joe Wendling was sent to the Gemini Lounge to confront DeMeo and to offer him a deal to see if he could be turned.
They knew Roy was involved in so many murders, so many killings, that he would be a wealth of information to the police.
Roy DeMeo was having none of it. Instead, Joe Wendling found it was DeMeo who was offering him a deal.
Roy said, "You can take me down. You guys, you're old timers. Why do you want to get involved in it? $1 million, Swiss bank account, wife's name. Give me the former and go live like a king." I turned around to Roy and I said, "I'd sooner take you out of the trunk of your car." I said, "But come with us and I'll save your life." He said, "I'm a good soldier. I'm in the mob. And when they call me, I'll go like a good soldier."
With the case coming together well and evidence building up, it seemed like it was only a matter of time before DeMeo would be in court. Then a disaster that risked ruining everything. As the trial date approached, Roy DeMeo went missing. The police searched for DeMeo. Informants said he was seen on the streets looking paranoid and heavily armed. Then, the police took a call. Roy DeMeo, the ruthless murderer, was found dead in the boot of his Cadillac.
I went down there, when they popped the trunk, there was Roy, frozen to a chandelier. And I said, man, what a tribute to us. They killed him. They killed this man who was such a moneymaker to them.
His Cadillac car was dumped in the parking lot behind the Varuna Boat Club in Brooklyn.
Roy DeMeo died the way he lived, as a street rat in a fetal position in the trunk of a car. There was no sympathy or empathy or anything like that from anybody in law enforcement, including myself.
The obvious question was, who might have done it? For the law enforcement team, Gambino family boss Paul Castellano was the man with the motive.
Roy DeMeo was killed because Paul Castellano decided he was a liability. They realized we were getting close to him, to DeMeo, and they felt that if we were able to arrest him and incarcerate him and turn him into an informant, he would have brought the whole empire down.
Castellano was right to be afraid. Even though he was dead, DeMeo had left plenty of damaging evidence. Evidence that would bring destruction to the family. Soon after, the task force raided the Gemini Lounge, armed with a search warrant.
We call our people in, and we take the bathroom apart, and in the drains we found the blood. Blood never goes away, contrary to what you might see on television. If blood is in pipes in a wall, the blood will remain there forever and identifiable. So we were able to do that. We were able to match the blood with the victims and the criminals and the whole routine. That's how we made our case.
This evidence led the team to DeMeo's boss and Castellano henchman, Nino Gaggi. The case evolved into US versus Gaggi. But Paul Castellano wasn't safe either. He too was called to face a trial. As the jury took a 2-week recess at Christmas 1985, Castellano headed out for a steak with a loyal associate. He was cut down by unknown gunmen.
So it was a setup. They bring him up there and they whack him as he's getting out of his car.
Paulie got whacked as a tribute to all of us and Walter, because of the fact we put in all the killers, all the top soldiers. This enabled them to kill Paul.
With Castellano gone, in a final trial, the remnants of the DeMeo crew and their capo, Nino Gaggi, stood trial for the remaining murders, including car thief Andre Katz.
It was not some case that was built overnight, done in a week. It was years of investigating, talking to informers, sending guys to Kuwait, and with the hard work of Walter Mack.
In the end, the worst killer the Mafia ever produced left as his legacy not only a crime family in disarray, but also something more chilling. Only a fraction of his murders had ever been solved. The truth is, we will never know the real number.
Roy bragged about 150 individuals, and I would say we're somewhere between 150 to 200 is probably an accurate number. I think Roy was extremely efficient and vicious in protecting his turf. We had people calling us, about their daughter that disappeared, who, hang out at the bars or stuff like that, and as to which we had no information.
As far as giving victims justice, that's kind of nebulous. How can you ever accomplish that? I'm of the school thinking that there is no such thing as closure for the families of victims. Roy DeMeo was as guilty of serial killing as any serial killer. Not only did he kill them, he cut their bodies up and defamed them and their humanity forever. This was a vicious, evil human being. If you could call him a human being, I wouldn't even call him that.
In missing several vital opportunities to stop DeMeo, the law enforcement machine must take its share of the blame. But that same law enforcement machine did eventually come together. Yet the overriding question remains, could it have done so sooner and found answers for the families of his victims? Benny Siegel, better known as Bugsy, was tall, good-looking, and charismatic, a charmer and a womanizer. He was also a gangster and a killer. He was a man with enemies. Late one June evening in 1947, he arrived at the Los Angeles home of his mistress with a friend. Siegel's mistress was away, and the two men made themselves at home. As with most mob killings, the murder of Bugsy Siegel was never solved. But the one name always associated with Siegel's death is the one name he would have least expected, that of his best friend, Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky was one of the most mysterious of all mob figures.
Little Meyer, quite tough, but not really a violent man.
For some, he was the Jewish mastermind behind the Mafia, pulling the strings from the shadows.
He was a financial genius of organized crime. He was also a killer, part of the New York Mafia, and very powerful and very successful.
But for others, he was little more than a middle manager for the mob. His sinister reputation, the product of media hype and hysteria.
The cold, hard evidence suggests that he wasn't quite the business brains that everybody thought he was or that he thought he was himself.
Mob mastermind or victim of his own legend. We unravel the enigma of Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky arrived in America in 1911 as an 8-year-old boy. He and his family were Jewish immigrants fleeing the brutal anti-Semitic pogroms of their native Russia.
He was scarred by what he saw as a small child. I think Meyer was rather focused on anti-Semitism and his belief that he is not going to lay down the way the Jews in Russia or Poland did, and the way he even felt his father did. And a lot of what Meyer felt being Jewish was not putting up with abuse and fighting back.
His family soon settled in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, New York's impoverished Jewish ghetto.
He grew up in a pretty tough district in New York. And whatever your size was, you had to be tough. You had to be able to take a beating and give a beating. And so he was small.
Just 5 feet 4 inches, Meyer Lansky quickly learned to use his fists and was soon in trouble with the law. It was at this time he'd first met another young Jewish hoodlum called Bugsy Siegel. The meeting happened when Siegel became involved in a street brawl.
Siegel had these charismatic good looks, and he got involved in a fight, a street fight, and he picked up a gun, and he was so transfixed with the fury of the fight and his anger that he raised the gun and was about to shoot somebody, and they could hear the police coming from all directions. It was only when Meyer sort of physically restrained him and pushed him away that he was able to save him. He said that was the beginning of their friendship, and that, of course, was actually the nature of their relationship.
Lansky was the brains, Siegel was the brawn. Together, the two young men formed the Jewish Bugs and Meyer gang.
You sort of get this sense that, oh, organized crime is Italian. But early in the century, the Jewish rackets were very, very powerful.
The gang stood up to the Italian and Irish toughs that came into their neighborhood to beat up Jews. They also engaged in more lucrative activities.
They were involved in what we'll call small-time criminal activities. Hijacking, loan sharking, gambling.
Lansky and Siegel's big break came in 1920 with the introduction of prohibition, the ban on the consumption of alcohol, a ban which spawned a lucrative illegal trade for mobsters of all ethnic groups.
It was prohibition that turned all of these low-level street predatory criminals into business executives because they had to figure out how to manufacture, import, distribute, sell, run real organizations.
The Bugs and Meyer gang was soon carving a niche for itself in New York's brutal gang wars. And it was at this time that Lansky made what would be the second key alliance of his life, with Italian mobster Charles Lucky Luciano, a man whose respect Lansky first earned when they were teenagers, and Luciano tried to rob him.
Famously, Luciano tried to shake him down, and Meyer told him in no uncertain terms, in very colorful language, where he could get off. You think that because I'm Jewish, I'm just going to fork over money. That's not going to happen today, buddy.
It was the start of one of the most important friendships in the history of organized crime, and of a groundbreaking Sicilian-Jewish alliance.
Luciano really didn't like the old-time Sicilian bosses, the notion that you only stick with your own. A lot of the newer, younger Italians, they didn't really care about the cultural precedent for setting up a gang. It had nothing to do with Sicily. They wanted to make money, and guys like Meyer, who were Jewish, wanted to make money.
With Lansky at his side, Luciano was soon shooting his way to the top of the New York underworld. By the summer of 1931, just one man stood between Luciano and total control: Salvatore Maranzano, a classic old-style Sicilian mob boss. Luciano turned to Lansky for help.
One of the stereotypes of the Jewish rackets is the Jewish guys handled the money and the Italian guys were the tough guys. Not true. Interestingly enough, when Luciano took over the Italian rackets, it was the Jewish muscle that played a big role.
The idea was that if you use Jewish gunmen, we get very ethnic now, if you use Jewish gunmen, the Italian criminals wouldn't be so suspicious because they wouldn't look like Italian hitmen or Sicilian hitmen.
At Luciano's bidding, Lansky organized a gang of Jewish assassins to visit Maranzano's offices on Park Avenue, posing as tax inspectors from the Inland Revenue Service.
One of the guys whose name was Red Levine, who was known for being an Orthodox Jew who would not kill on the Sabbath. But Maranzano was so bigoted that he felt if some Jewish bean counter IRS guys came to his office, they couldn't do him any harm. Well, not only did they do him harm, they killed him.
With Maranzano dead, Luciano became the king of New York and set about establishing the structures of the modern Mafia. Meyer Lansky now sat at the right hand of the most powerful mobster in America. But he knew there would always be limits on his power.
Lansky could never be a leader for one reason. He could never be a member because he wasn't of Italian or Sicilian extract. He was a Jew and he knew his place. He was highly respected as somebody who had the ear of Luciano, who could talk to Luciano, and he was a great entrepreneur in criminal endeavors. But he was never a kingmaker or in a position of authority.
From now on, Lansky's role would be that of a chief executive in his various criminal enterprises. Powerful, but answerable ultimately to Sicilian bosses. By now, he'd married and quickly had 3 children, the oldest of whom, Buddy, suffered from cerebral palsy. Otherwise, life was good. He left the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side behind and took an apartment in the exclusive Majestic building, overlooking Central Park on New York's Upper West Side. With the abolition of Prohibition in 1933, he branched out into a new business, one that would dominate the rest of his life.
Meyer Lansky was brilliant mathematically, and his real interest was gambling because he had a knack for it.
Lansky was good with numbers. And the whole idea of gambling is you got to be quick with numbers, you got to know the odds.
He could tell you if it came to craps, well, the proportion for the table was 4.5, and if it was blackjack, it was 5.2.
Gambling was illegal, but widely tolerated, and Lansky was soon running casinos in New York, Florida, and a number of other states. Paradoxically, his casinos made money because they were honest.
The tables would not be fixed because he knew exactly how to take his profit without cheating anybody.
You don't have to be dishonest to win. You have to have volume. As long as you keep gambling, you'll lose.
By the end of the 1930s, Lansky's casinos had made him a wealthy man. But the little Jewish immigrant from the Lower East Side craved something more than wealth.
Right through Lansky's life, there is this wish to be respectable. And right through Lansky's life, there is this feeling that he is not a criminal, that he is a citizen like any other.
There is no doubt that the American people need an adequate merchant marine.
How did Joe Kennedy make his money? What was the foundation of the Kennedy family fortune. Joe Kennedy was a bootlegger, and he was able to launder his fortune and use it to pay his son's way to become President of the United States. Meyer Lansky literally compared himself to Joe Kennedy and felt he was no more immoral than that man had been.
He actually had a snobbish streak. This was somebody who studied history. This is somebody, when his friends were out carousing at night, would hire tutors.
Lansky sent his own second son, Paul, to study at the military academy, West Point.
He would jot down if he saw a vocabulary word that he was interested in. You can see in his handwriting, he would write about it in a book. I remember one of the things he wrote was, determine how to pronounce Thucydides.
The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 and America's entry into the Second World War provided Lansky with an extraordinary and unexpected opportunity to prove his patriotism and win the respectability he craved. In February 1942, a large troop carrier called the Normandy caught fire and capsized in New York Harbor.
The death of a queen. Now the $60 million luxury liner lies on her side, mortally stricken.
The Navy suspected sabotage. Many of the men who worked on the docks were Italian, a nation America was now at war with. When the Navy attempted to investigate, they found the waterfront an impenetrable, closed world.
The longshoremen by nature are not the kind of guys who take well to men in uniform, government uniform, coming onto the docks and saying, I'd like you to snitch. So Roosevelt is distraught by this. Pearl Harbor has just happened. The Navy is explaining to him, Mr. President, we don't control the docks. And Roosevelt is, what do you mean we don't control the docks? We're the U.S. government. Well, Mr. President, you were governor of New York. Do you remember who ran the docks? Ah, okay.
At that time, the docks in New York were controlled by the mob.
The FBI and the war intelligence authorities suddenly realized the only way they were going to find out about what was going on the waterfront in New York was to actually come to terms with the so-called underworld, figures like Lucky Luciano. The trouble was, Luciano was in jail.
Luciano had been imprisoned in 1936 on charges of organizing prostitution. He was looking at a sentence of 30 to 50 years. The Navy needed a go-between. Enter Meyer Lansky, a Jew who already had impeccable anti-Nazi credentials. In the 1930s, New York's Jewish community had been threatened by the rise of the pro-Nazi German-American Bund. Jewish leaders had turned to Lansky, one of the few members of their community with the muscle to confront Nazi thugs.
The Bund found themselves under siege by Meyer's boys. Meyer and Ben Siegel, and Meyer actually personally went to some of these rallies. They would go and bust them up. They would hit them over the head with bats, and they would really terrorize these Bund members.
When the Navy approached him in 1942 to help them on the docks, Lansky immediately agreed to help. He arranged for Luciano to be moved to a more comfortable jail, closer to New York, and acted as a mediator in talks between the Navy and the Sicilian mobster.
It's an extraordinary story. Lansky says, can Luciano be moved? And then you see, because there was an official inquiry into this after the war, you see the actual documents saying, move Luciano, Mr. Meyer Lansky is going to come up and visit him. Do not request Mr. Lansky's passport. Do not take Mr. Lansky's fingerprints.
What then resulted was a deal where Luciano could meet with his men in prison, where he hadn't been able to do that before. And yes, he gave the order to cooperate with the Navy, but he also was allowed to conduct business.
It was an extraordinary deal, and it yielded almost immediate results. In June 1942, 8 Nazi spies were arrested following a tip-off from mob-controlled fishermen, an event later trumpeted by the FBI in this publicity film, although the Mafia's role in capturing the spies was not mentioned. The following year provided the mob with an even more dramatic opportunity to lend assistance to the war effort. The invasion of Sicily, home country of the Mafia.
Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano bring Sicilian assets, contacts in New York, to naval intelligence and help design the maps, determine what the tides were, what good invasion locations were, beach terrain, and where Nazi strongholds were.
As American troops poured ashore in Sicily, the mob assistance proved invaluable. But the Navy knew it was playing a dangerous game.
The only thing worse than Operation Underworld, as it was called, failing, what if it succeeds? You're now in business with the mob.
Sicily was conquered in just 6 weeks. But this was not a story that the US government wanted made public. The mob's wartime collaboration was hushed up. Charlie Luciano was released from prison, but immediately deported to Italy. As for Lansky, he found that in the eyes of the government, he remained a hoodlum. His patriotism had failed to win him respectability. And if he really wanted to leave the streets behind, there was another millstone hanging around his neck. Bugsy Siegel.
Siegel stayed on killing people even after Meyer kind of slid out of this, what they used to call the Bugs and Meyer mob. Bugsy Siegel was a wacko. He was a crazy guy, and he did a lot of the... I never saw any indication that Lansky himself ever killed anybody. Siegel, on the other hand, he enjoyed it, and he killed a lot of people. Now, how many, I don't know. Could have been 5, could have been 20.
Siegel had by now moved to California, where his film star looks helped gain him entree to the Hollywood set. But Siegel's dreams were focused elsewhere. A few hours' drive inland, a dusty desert stopover called Las Vegas.
There were these rundown gambling operations in this desert city, Las Vegas, that already existed there. What Siegel realized was these dusty, smoky, rundown places had potential to be something bigger.
The great advantage of Las Vegas was that it was in Nevada, the one state in the Union where gambling was legal. Siegel set about building his own luxury hotel casino, the Flamingo, the first in Las Vegas, with money borrowed from Lansky and other East Coast mobsters. The project quickly ran into trouble.
He never respected budgets. He thought that everything was limitless. And what starts as $1 million ends up becoming, you know what, it's not $1 million, I need 3. You know what, it's not 3, I need 6.
The situation was complicated by the influence of Siegel's girlfriend, glamorous former dancer and mob courier Virginia Hill.
No.
Her abrasive personality would later be displayed before a Senate commission on organized crime.
I never got money from any of those fellas. None of those fellas. None of these that I've been reading about, and none that I knew. They never gave me anything.
Siegel's mob backers suspected Virginia Hill was stealing their money. But Bugsy Siegel was not the sort of man to listen to criticism of either himself or his girlfriend.
He was a very arrogant guy who would just basically tell him to go screw, you know, and he wasn't going to deal with these. He left it to Lansky to deal with these guys back in the East Coast.
Meyer pleaded with Ben Siegel to get things under control at the Flamingo, to start being more respectful of investors, to stop running around Hollywood going to parties. But you don't tell a 41-year-old man that you're not going to go trick-or-treating if you misbehave.
Eventually, the patience of Siegel's mob backers ran out. Just a few hours after Siegel's death, the Flamingo Hotel received a couple of visitors.
Two men, Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum, walked into the Flamingo and said, we're in charge now. And somebody said, well, this is Ben Siegel's place. And they said, Ben is dead.
Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum were both business partners of Meyer Lansky's. It is inconceivable Lansky had been unaware of the fate that awaited his oldest friend. 40 years later, after Lansky's death, Lansky's second wife, Teddy, was asked about the murder.
I think he felt badly for the family, and they were buddies from the time they were youngsters.
There were reports that he was involved in the death.
I don't believe that. Circumstances sometimes make you think, but he would never directly have anything to do with anything like that.
Directly.
That's right.
Lansky may not have ordered Siegel's death, but he benefited. For all that he craved respectability, this was the life he'd chosen.
I suppose we could say there's a hypocrisy here. In all my research into Lansky, I never discovered him being personally responsible, personally fingering, personally instructing the death of anyone. But he made his money and he worked in an environment where murder was the ultimate sanction and where those who failed to stick by the code paid in that way.
The image of Lansky as a dangerous mobster was about to become forever established in the public consciousness. In 1950, the US Congress set up the Kefauver Commission, its first ever probe into organized crime.
You must have in your mind some things you've done that you can speak of to your credit as an American citizen. If so, what are they?
Paid my tax.
The commission focused primarily on the easy target of gambling, with the result that Lansky emerged as a far more important figure in organized crime than he was. Lansky was furious.
In one of the breaks in the hearings, Meyer said to Kefauver, Senator, I don't know what you have against gambling. You gamble. And Kefauver snapped, that's true. I do like gambling. I just don't want you people controlling it. You people. And one of the things that Meyer wrote in private notes is that gambling will become the biggest business in America once they run the Jewish and Italian boys. You people, out of it.
In fact, Senator Kefauver gambled on horses, which was perfectly legal. But for Lansky, It was another example of the hypocrisy of the establishment. The elite always looked upon gambling as an evil, Lansky wrote. Only when they used it as a pleasure or for the purpose of personal gain was it legitimate and not sinful. Once more, he felt he was a victim of anti-Semitism.
You just had to say Jewish financier in the background, working with Italian mobsters. It played to so many stereotypes. It was so damning to Meyer Lansky's reputation. He never recovered from it.
In the aftermath of the Kefauver Commission, there was a crackdown on illegal casinos of the type Lansky ran in New York, Florida, and other states.
Let this be a warning to all racketeers and gangsters that they of their ilk will not be tolerated in San Francisco.
For Lansky, his dream of respectability seemed further off than ever. But as one door closed, another opened. Cuba in the 1950s was Las Vegas by the sea.
Cuba was better. Havana was better than Las Vegas. First of all, it was closer to New York. It was close to Florida. They could bring these people on airplanes, you know, quickly, and lots of them. Bring the entertainers in. Have an open city with every kind of vice you could imagine, with girls and pornography and cockfights and whatever guys like. Havana was the best of the best.
Lansky was invited to Cuba in 1953 by Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista to help run the country's casinos.
When Lansky and some of his friends arrived, they were welcomed because they would run straight games. And then from Lansky's point of view, how marvelous to come to a country where they are not hypocritically denounced, but their skills are recognized.
Lansky helped turn Havana into America's playground, where the elite could enjoy all the vices denied them in the newly moralistic atmosphere back home. Among those who visited was future President John F. Kennedy.
Did Meyer know John Kennedy from Havana days, from trips there?
Yes.
What was he looking for in Havana? Gambling, women?
You said the second one.
Oh, a lot of people look for that in Havana.
Oh, yes. He told them where to go for it.
Lansky now embarked on his most ambitious project yet, the construction of the Riviera Hotel Casino on the Havana seafront.
We know from the evidence of the Riviera Hotel that by the mid-50s, he was worth $17, $18 million, which was a lot of money in those days. And he plowed it all into bricks and mortar and air conditioning and gold tiles and so on. It's a wonderful hotel by the standards of the 1950s. It's the first to have air conditioning. You go inside the casino, it's a wonderful mosaic tiled egg-shaped room. Still, with all the glamour of a Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall film. And that's where he put his money.
It was the largest single investment Lansky ever made.
I think Meyer was focusing on Havana to clean up his fortune. That was going to be his Kennedy moment. Havana was legal.
But Lansky had bet wrong. By the time the Riviera opened in 1958, Fidel Castro's leftist rebels were closing in on the capital. In the early hours of New Year's Day, 1959, the dictator fled the country.
At first, the celebration was peaceful as shouting, cheering crowds surged through the city. the temper of the throng changed, and an ugly mob ranged the streets. Its prime targets, the symbols of the overthrown regime. The gambling casinos, the parking meters, the homes and businesses of Batista's cronies.
The casinos were looted and then seized by the new government.
6 years of surplus.
When Castro came out of the hills, Lansky lost his money, Pepsi Cola lost their money, United Tobacco lost their money, General Motors lost their money. All the big American corporations lost the money that they had. So the world's cleverest gambler, at the end of the day, made a bad gamble.
Lansky now moved permanently to Miami. He was almost 60 and in poor health, but his return to America coincided with a renewed offensive against organized crime.
Attorney General Robert Kennedy paints a grim picture of the rise of lawlessness under the Cosa Nostra, or Mafia. This he describes as the government of organized gambling, narcotics peddling, extortion, racketeering, and controlling of certain trade unions.
With Bobby Kennedy at the Justice Department, the government had the Mafia in its sights. Lansky was still regarded as the mastermind of the mob and found himself under almost constant surveillance.
Meyer is being dogged 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by the authorities, by local authorities, by the FBI.
I knew them by heart. They were my buddies. If I saw them at the racetrack, I used to tell them, I'm going to report you to the FBI. You're not supposed to be gambling.
His wife, Teddy, one time was asked, did your husband have bodyguards? She said, yeah, the FBI. They were always there.
Listening bugs were placed in his house and at hotels he stayed in, but they yielded little. Spends much time lounging around his home, read this report from July the 7th, 1962. Main pursuits seem to be playing gin rummy with friends, watching TV, and reading.
All those wiretaps, bugs that the FBI did in the 1960s, every single bug was successful in getting good stuff, good intelligence for the FBI, except Lansky's. Lansky's was a total zero.
But the bugging did yield one conversation, which has gone down in mob folklore. It happened on the evening of May 27th, 1962. While subject and wife were watching television, the FBI report read, TV panelists referred to organized crime as being second only in size to the government itself. Lansky remarked to his wife that organized crime was bigger than US Steel. Lansky's exact words were not written down, and the tape was then reused, but the report was later leaked to the press. By the time the movie Godfather 2 was made in 1974, the scriptwriters had Hyman Roth, a character based on Lansky, narrowing his eyes and murmuring, "Michael, we're bigger than US Steel."
In fact, the record shows he did not say we are bigger than US Steel. And of course, since it's not recorded, we don't know in what tone he said it. Could he have been sardonic? Could he have been sarcastic and saying, it's bigger than US Steel? We don't know. But he himself would always say, when am I supposed to have said that? But of course, it stuck to him like a sort of catchphrase for the rest of his life, and of course, was finally immortalized on the silver screen.
In March 1970, police finally managed to arrest Lansky at Miami Airport on drugs charges.
The drug bust in 1970, I thought, was a travesty and a joke, because basic charge was that he left the country to go to Mexico for a vacation, I believe, and had these drugs on him without having a prescription for it.
so-called drugs were in fact medicines for a stomach complaint.
I thought it was pure poppycock.
The case was thrown out, but Lansky had had enough. For 40 years, he had sought respectability and acceptance as an American citizen. Now, he turned his back on his adopted country. In July 1970, he moved to Israel and applied for citizenship.
All through his life, he has had this pride in his Jewish identity. He takes pride in the creation of the State of Israel, which puts into practice the toughness and the courage that he saw back in his youth in Grodno. And here's a whole country that embodies it.
Lansky is living in an exclusive resort hotel, the Acadia, north of Tel Aviv. He's not exactly in the market for publicity.
Lansky found himself pursued by the American media. But while in Israel, he granted Israeli TV a rare interview, presenting himself as a victim of persecution.
Mr. Lansky, if the accusations against you are false, why don't you go back to the United States and demand justice?
I think it would be terribly hard for one to get a fair trial, as much as I believe in the American courts.
Are you a religious Jew?
No, I'm not a religious Jew.
And what
But I am a Jew in my heart.
I think that there was probably a sense that we're all mishpucha, we're all family. And of course they're going to let me in. There's a law, the law of return. What they didn't bank on was that it would be a political hot potato.
The Americans were still pursuing Lansky and were pressuring for his return. The case was referred to Israel's Prime Minister, Golda Meir.
She didn't know Meyer Lansky from hole in the wall. And somebody said he wants to be a citizen of Israel, and she said, fine, I don't see any problem with that. And another one of her advisors said, you know, we understand he's in the Mafia. Golda Meir said, Mafia? Mafia? No Mafia.
Lansky's application for citizenship was denied, and he was expelled from Israel. Lansky's wife, Teddy, arrived back in America literally spitting with fury.
Now look, go away from me, I'll kill you!
Lansky himself was immediately arrested. The government had finally succeeded in putting together a case against him, a case that rested on the evidence of a low-level mobster turned police informant called Fat Vinny.
Fat Vinny was Vincent Teresa, who was a hoodlum from Massachusetts. He was, a thief and an extortionist, and he had been a federal witness in 38 Mafia trials that the Department of Justice had brought.
Fat Vinny claimed that in 1968, he'd made 2 deliveries of cash to Meyer Lansky of income from the Colony Club Casino in London. It was the big break the government had been looking for.
Here's a guy who actually was willing to testify, who put money in Lansky's hands, $150,000. That's substantial compared to what his tax return said.
Like Al Capone 40 years before, Lansky was facing charges of tax evasion. Arriving at court, he was relaxed.
Are you pleased with the way your attorneys handled your defense?
I'm sorry, but no comment.
Well, you can't blame me for asking, can you?
No, I don't blame you at all.
Inside, the assistant prosecutor found a man very different from the one he had been expecting.
He was a gentleman, not a wise guy. It was clear that he'd read a lot. He was very articulate, very charming. If you didn't know any better, you'd think he was an executive of an American corporation.
The prosecution was led by a young Justice Department attorney called R.J. Campbell.
We felt that if he had to defend himself, we could really get after him, because I had a mountain of material to cross-examine him on. So I was ready, prepared long and hard for Lansky to take the stand. He did not take the stand. What he did was put his wife on the stand.
Teddy Lansky produced receipts from a hotel to show her husband had been in Boston at precisely the time Fat Vinny claimed to have been handing money to him in Miami.
So, you know, we were hanging by our threads, right? Because once the witness has lied about one thing in his testimony, you are a gone goose.
It was a very thin case. We'd have been better off leaving Lansky in Israel.
Lansky was acquitted. The little man walked free. For some, it was further evidence of his fiendish brilliance. But for others, doubts were beginning to creep in that Lansky really was as rich and powerful as the government and the press claimed.
Let's put it this way, he lived very modestly. We never caught him spending much money on anything. He had nice suits. It doesn't cost that much to buy a suit. You know? He just lived modestly.
Have a good weekend.
So, mastermind of the mob, or as Lansky himself claimed, a retired investor living on a modest pension. Only in 1983 would the truth be revealed. Lansky died in his bed of cancer. His family gathered for the reading of the will. They too were hoping it would reveal hidden riches. They were disappointed.
I do believe there was a moment of recognition that, boy, this reality is very different than we thought it would be. Because to my knowledge, nobody in that family has a lot of money, and it's not because they secretly do and have hidden it so cleverly. I don't buy it.
I spent a lot of time with his crippled son, Buddy, who, after his death, was living on state charity, something Meyer had always tried to avoid in his lifetime, but he couldn't leave enough money for his beloved crippled son to survive. I think it defies the rules of human behavior that they would go through such denial of comfort for the sake of proving what?
Meyer Lansky never was the all-powerful godfather some believed. And he lost the bulk of the fortune he had in Havana in 1959. Under constant surveillance by the government, from 1960, he was effectively retired. And he spent most of what he had left on his various legal battles.
How would you describe yourself? As a human being.
He saw himself as a victim of hypocrisy, even anti-Semitism. But Meyer Lansky never was quite the mastermind the American public believed. He shone only in comparison with other mobsters.
Most of these organized crime guys, they're not educated at all. So we're not operating from a very high plane. So a guy comes along like Lansky, who is quick and good with numbers, and he stands out. He's only bright in connection with the other people around him. He certainly wasn't in Bill Gates and Warren Buffett's league.
You know, the cold hard evidence of Meyer Lansky, the businessman, suggests that he wasn't quite the business brains that everybody thought he was, or that he thought he was himself.
But the American public is reluctant to abandon the myth.
The great irony is the proof you are a mastermind is that nobody can find any proof. Everybody was running around looking for banks and pawns in this vast game, and they couldn't find them. And then when they couldn't find them, they said, man, this guy's good. There is this belief, especially in America, in the mystical power of the mob. And so when Meyer Lansky would walk his dog, people would go, ah, he's just walking his dog. He's doing the whole walking his dog low-key ruse. No, he was walking his dog.